what time it is. Buckle up and enjoy the ride. And we are live. Greetings to our loyal WFYL listeners around the world. Welcome back to your Philadelphia live stream, only on the Freedom Station. I want to thank each and every one of you for tuning in once again, because you still have the right to hear and the right to be heard. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mike G, and as a matter of fact, today it is only Mike G, and you're listening to Mike G in the Morning with The Law Matters. And you can listen to our program every Friday at 7 a.m. Eastern, only on the Freedom Station, WFYL. So let's be heard. I want to remind our listeners that you can participate in the free and open exchange of thoughts and ideas throughout the entire week by visiting MikeGinthemorning.com. If you visit that website, you can catch the links to our YouTube channel. You can check us out through the live stream. So tell your friends, tell your family, tell your barber, tell your Uncle Jerry, tell anybody who will listen to check us out at MikeGinthemorning.com. If you haven't already, subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also want to remind our listeners about the powerhouse lineup we've got here at the Freedom Station. Kick off your mornings with Scott Adams. Bring you the Scott Adams Show weekdays from 9 a.m. until 11. We've got Dan the Man Bongino. Bring you the Dan Bongino Show weekdays from noon until 3 p.m. We've got the headliner, intellectual giant Ben Shapiro. Bring you the Ben Shapiro Show weekdays at 3 p.m. And finally, we love having him at the Freedom Station family. We've got Michael Knowles. Bring you the Michael Knowles Show weekdays from 5 to 6 p.m. So don't forget to tune in and show him some love. And with that, you know what time it is. Buckle up and enjoy the ride. You heard me correctly. It is solely Mike G on this program today. We've got some of our loyal listeners from the Mike G in the Morning family tuning in. I see DG giving us a hey now to DG. I see Rita checking in. Give her a hey now. And Stacks Farmstead says workers strike and Mike G in the Morning. Well, not quite. If we're being completely candid, Russell has a scheduled vacation, so he was scheduled to be off. He deserves off every once in a while, from all the stuff that he does, right? And we've got Philly Chris. It is his birthday today, so he is out enjoying that with family. Now, Liberty Lee could not make it. We do have a guest who's going to be joining on this program. His name is Chris Jones. He is a U.S. Law Shield representative from the New England area. And I think it'll be interesting to speak with him a little bit about the firearms culture in New England. Personally, I've sort of got a couple of different places that I've experienced the firearms culture on a long-term basis. One being New York, where I was born and raised, where it was absolutely zero. Then out in Oklahoma, where obviously citizens are heavily armed and they embrace that firearms culture. And then Pennsylvania, where I've resided since after law school, decided to take up my practice defending our Second Amendment rights. And New England is a place where I'm unfamiliar with in terms of the firearms culture. I know that they're notorious for having very stringent gun laws in Massachusetts and Connecticut. So it'll be interesting to hear from him how they treat firearms over there and what gun owners are like and really what they're up against. See a lot of birthday wishes from Stacks, from DG, for Philly Chris. I'm sure he will be happy to hear that. Before Chris comes on, it's just going to be myself. And frankly, I was thinking about what to talk about today. And I'm really interested in hearing what our listeners have on their minds. Because frankly, there's a whole lot going on in the world today. And I'm not exactly sure what everyday Americans see as their primary concern. And when we talk about a lot going on in the world, we've got the war in Ukraine. Biden can't stop posting about it, and the never-ending support. And we're in this for the long haul. People are recognizing that we have high food prices. This is something that's impacting Americans on a daily basis. We've even got ongoing government discussions about unidentified flying objects and alien life. That's starting to creep in. We've got gas prices that I know the Biden administration is bragging about how low they've come, but the fact is they're still high. We've got people who are dealing with supply chain shortages and just a whole lot of different things happening in the world today. I'm curious as to what people see as their number one issue because as this next presidential election starts to unfold, and we're going to have a lot of different candidates. You could see that the field's going to be flooded on the Republican side. And you even have RFK Jr. attempting to challenge Joe Biden in the primaries from the left. And this really comes down to who has their thumb on the pulse of society, who adequately addresses the concerns of the everyday citizen, because I think politicians tend to get that wrong. And sometimes it's tough to determine what's the number one concern for people or what are the primary concerns for people unless you actually ask, you sit down, you talk with people, and you listen. And that seems to be something that people are not that great at these days, is actually listening to what people have to say. So I'm curious what our listeners think about their primary concern. Because if you watch the news, you're just absolutely flooded. You get attacked from all angles. You get this 24-hour news cycle, and they go from one thing to the next thing to the next thing. It's really difficult to keep up. And frankly, you'll be overloaded if you pay too much attention to that stuff. I wonder how many of our listeners devote more of a focus to their daily lives, because I think at the end of the day, regardless of what's going on around us, there are always going to be things that we cannot control. And it comes down to our own personal mindset. And it comes down to how we handle our priorities. Is your priority your family? And of course, there are going to be things that pop in. We've got a surprise guest that looks like Liberty's popping in. I don't know if Liberty's in a place to actually speak, but Liberty just joined us here in the backstage area. But ultimately, prioritizing your family, that takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort. And I think that a lot of people have drifted their focus from that. And as a result, we see how our culture in the United States has changed and the impact that it has on the generations. DG says, as an independent conservative, I believe we need to focus locally first with politicians and right call and demand these local level state and county to be transparent. I would agree with you on that. I think people pay too much attention sometimes to the federal government on the national level when there are very important things taking place state and locally. And sometimes these elections, frankly, state and locally, get ignored because they don't get the airtime that you would get from these national elections. Rita says, "Hey now," Liberty giving her "hey now." But when you decide to focus your priorities on your family, your home first, and sometimes, depending on what's going on, it seems as if there's certainly no room for all the information that's being thrown your way. You got to figure out where you're going to get this information and selectively take it in. Stacks Farm says, my concern, taxes going up, food prices going up, and a devalued dollar. That's certainly a concern that you hear quite often. And taxes is something that I hadn't mentioned, so it's a very good point. The devalued dollar, that's something that we're going to have to deal with. And DG says, get involved, and not just with lip service or social media. So how does one get involved if you've got these concerns about taxes going up, food prices going up, and a devalued dollar? Obviously, you can get out there and you can vote. DG says healthcare is a mess too. We could talk for hours and hours about all the things that are wrong right now. Frankly, I don't see how somebody in today's America, if they voted for our president, takes a look around and says, yeah, this is exactly what I hoped for. This is what I was hoping for. And no matter how many other candidates come on the Republican side, you still see this strong support for Trump, regardless of the fact that he's dealing with these legal issues. You see a lot of support for Trump. And I was trying to think of why that may be, that so many people still support him, they stick by his side, from their perspective. Why do they do that? And what it came down to in my head is I think that the possibility is that you look back on the 4 years that he was in office We weren't talking about these things that we're talking about right now, were we? We weren't talking about concern about taxes going up wasn't necessarily concerned. Food prices going up, gas prices, things of that nature. The devalued dollar, I think that's not something that the Trump administration was exempt from by any means, particularly given what happened with the turnip and everything like that. But a lot of these concerns were not at the front of our minds at that point in time. And it was just sort of people able to live their lives at home with their families on the local level, things of that nature. And today we're presented with this whole host of other problems. Now, when Trump was in office, people who did not support Trump initially or maybe didn't care for him at the outset and outright opposed him, all they saw was the chaos that surrounded the left going after Trump constantly. That was the chaos pre-pandemic, of course. Once you got into the whole turnip situation, that was an entirely different ball game, and I don't know how to compare that to just about anything else in history, really. When you see what actually took place and all the forces that were in play. But when you look at what happened prior to that and the way things were for the everyday American and their life, uh, life was normal. Things were good. And the only chaos that was going on was the media talking about all the terrible things that they believed Trump were doing and all the attacks on Trump. That's really what it was about. The chaos was about the attacks that were on Trump. And outside of that, you didn't have these problems. And I think some people are starting to realize that, well, if you just turn off the news, maybe didn't pay attention to that, my life was actually pretty good. Stacks Farm says, I've never made more money than when Trump was in office ever. I think a lot of people would say the same exact thing. Dag Nabbit says the same exact thing. Says same here, Stacks. Things were going pretty well. DG says fear to look at ourselves. That's ultimately when we look at the way life was when Trump was in office versus the way things are now. We have these added concerns. And you look at the way the media covers this stuff. There are a lot of kid gloves going on with this administration. There are a lot of things, frankly, I shouldn't even call it kid gloves because it's dishonesty. There's a lot of things that are not covered at all, or the way they're covered are disingenuous at best. We got drugs and being found in the White House. Drugs being found in the White House, and they're not able to figure out whose drugs they were. Are you serious? They said, oh, no fingerprints, no DNA, no cameras either, right? There's no way to figure out where those drugs came from. You got to be kidding me. And that doesn't get covered, right? That's not a big deal. Anybody who suggests where those drugs may have come from is a conspiracy theorist. And that's not the sort of thing that we were dealing with when Trump was in office. That's really the type of thing that if it had happened when Trump were in office, that would become front and center. And, forget anything else. There wasn't much talk about how positive certain things were through the media coverage. And it's really interesting to see the agenda that's being pushed forward through the way they cover things. DG wants to know, how did it get this way? Well, you had people who bought into, certainly, the idea that Trump had to go at all costs. And maybe the reasons why weren't necessarily the most articulate. Dag Nabbit says, not that I'm making less money now. It just doesn't go as far anymore. And that's it exactly. It's a silent tax of sorts, right? It's not that you're making any less money, but things cost more. And so that creates a whole host of its own problems. There's just so much to pay attention to, though, in the way of the things that are going on. It seems almost by design that there are millions upon millions upon millions of distractions. And if there were something to look at and say, hey, we need to address this right now, then it would be almost like dealing with a needle in a haystack, because that's how things are covered these days. You've got beyond the 24-hour news cycle, you got things down to the minute when it comes to social media. So ultimately, when there is something that could have a major impact on people, and if you do pick it out, that's the thing, though. The way the media is handling these things, the way the administration's handling these things, and just the left in general, frankly, and many people on the right, the establishment people on the right, when you do pick one of these things out, if it's something they really don't want you to talk about, what do they say? They say that you're a conspiracy theorist, or that you're a science denier, or you're an election denier, or whatever it may be. They've got all these names and these labels that they place on you. It's very interesting how there's so many things out there about conspiracy theorists and conspiracies and how much harm they're doing. But these people who go out there and put this stuff out, uh, admonishing people who aren't lockstep with the narrative, they don't seem to acknowledge what happens when some of these conspiracy theories, quote unquote, turn out to be true. What do we do in those instances? Is it just too bad, too sad? We all dragged you through the mud and called you a crazy person and got you fired from your job and completely discredited you and perhaps doxed you, talked about how harmful you were. Well, turns out you were right. There's no justice for those people. DG says, no offense to you because you aren't this way, but many attorneys could join together and hold these corrupt politicians to the U.S. Constitution and empower the people again. Well, it's an interesting point. How exactly? What's the mechanism to do so? What's the vehicle to get there? Bringing a lawsuit for some kind of wrongdoing? Well, you got to put together a case if that's it, right? You got to actually have the evidence. You've got to make your case, and a case that's going to succeed. Dagnabbit says people didn't like mean tweets. Maybe that's why some people oppose Trump. Well, I wonder if anybody's changed their mind since then when they've seen the impact that these policies are having on their everyday life, having on their ability to provide for their family and give their family the life that they've become accustomed to. Because that's not easy. You wake up every day, you go to work, you take care of your family. That's not easy. And when there are outside forces making that more difficult, that wears on you. And all we can do right now is have a positive attitude, continue to care for our own, and do what we can, control the things that we can control, and make a change, actually do something about it. Because sitting here and complaining about it all day, that's not going to help. Perhaps it raises awareness to some degree. I hope that people listen to our program when we're talking about these issues and say, yes, that resonates with me. I agree. I am dealing with that. Thank you for not gaslighting us, because the gaslighting is incredible when you listen to mainstream media. They'll tell you that what you're seeing just isn't true, or what you're experiencing just isn't true. We have the economy is obviously doing exceptionally well. That's what we were told, right? The economy is doing exceptionally well. I wonder how the regular hardworking American feels when they hear that, because they are having to make adjustments in their daily lives. DG says, educate the people first who've been too focused on material items and focused on money, 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 don't value any life and not just the unborn. Well, I'll tell you what, that's certainly a distinction that we see, at least in our country today, probably in the world as a whole. And that's got to be what it is, because in the field that I'm in, when you're dealing with firearms, gun rights, we often hear how the government needs to make it more difficult for people to own firearms, that there's way too much access to firearms and it's easy access. Well, that's simply not true if you look at the history of the United States, right? What do I mean? If you talk to somebody who grew up, let's say, in the 1960s or the 1950s, they would probably tell you in many parts of the United States that children brought firearms to school. And certainly in rural areas, you'll have children who brought their rifles to school if they were going hunting. But even in New York City, I've heard from the older generation that they had shooting teams at these schools, even in Brooklyn, New York. So people did have access to firearms. Somehow, none of these children ended up shooting up the school. None of them ended up shooting each other. I can't say that it never, ever happened, but it was not something that was prevalent, certainly, right? We don't have these pages in our history books about the 1950s when everybody was shooting everybody at school because they all brought their guns to school for hunting or for the shooting team. We don't see that. Access to firearms has never been more difficult than it is today. So what I'm saying is that when you look back to the 1950s and the 1960s, even pre-Gun Control Act of 1968, it was easier to access firearms and got increasingly more difficult. And as the access became more difficult, we didn't see this dramatic decrease in crime where all this stuff went out the window and the problem was solved, did we? So my point is that if access to firearms were the problem, we would have known about it back then. And if as you restrict the access, you don't see that positive change, then it's clearly not the access. Something deeper is going on here. It's something that's deeply rooted in our culture. The values, the fundamental values that people have in our country are not what they were in the 1950s and the 1960s. They're not. People are not raised the same way. The nuclear family is being dismissed, right? The government will step in. They'll pay your bills. They'll take care of your health care. They'll take care of everything. Just let the government do everything. Let them raise your kids. Let them make the choices about your kids, what gender they're going to be. Government will step in. They'll take care of everything. Perhaps that's the change that we've seen since the 1950s and the 1960s. Dag Nabbit says you could buy your gun at the local hardware store, no background check. There was a time in this country where that were true. And if you listen to the people today who are the anti-gunners, they'll tell you that if that were the case, then there would be no living bodies left in the United States of America. Well, guess what? That's not what happened. There's been a change in our values in the United States of America. There's not that value for human life that you had back then. For those of us just tuning in, you're listening to Mike G in the Morning with The Law Matters, only on the Freedom Station, WFYL. We've got a very special guest joining us. We've got Christopher Jones. I think we had 1.5 guests there for a minute. Was that the Mrs. Jones walking in?
Yes. We just rushed in from dinner, and she was curious as to what was going on, and
I'm on the air, honey.
and then and then exactly that, she realized, hey, you're being broadcast right now, and she quickly bailed out.
Well, the 100,000 listeners over the airwaves won't be able to hear her appearance in the morning. But certainly everybody who's viewing now and later on will be able to see. So thank you to Mrs. Jones for the brief appearance. Ladies and gentlemen, I mentioned at the top of the hour, Chris Jones is in the firearms industry in New England, and he's worked with U.S. Law Shield in Massachusetts and Connecticut, among others. And he's also the host of a podcast called The Adverse Theory. Did I get that correct? I didn't have my notes pulled up.
Yeah, I haven't put anything out on that in a while. It was during COVID, and I had a great idea, and I ran with it for a little bit, but no disrespect to anybody who appeared on there with me, but it wasn't intended to become an outlet just for people to talk about their frustrations with COVID. But that's really all that it turned into. I would have you on and we would talk about, let's talk about your legal practice. Let's talk about, some of the ups and downs you've had professionally in your life, things like that. And then it would always, water would always find its level. It would always just go back to COVID. And it was at the height of, everyone, starting to sniff out, hey, I think this is, I think there's something afoot here. And it wasn't what it was intended to be. And that's what it became. So I got a little frustrated with it. And I was like, this isn't how I initially anticipated this, but
it was a weird time, though. It was a weird time. People were dealing with things that they've never dealt with before. So that would be a tough time to get started. Some of our listeners are familiar with this, but prior to the pandemic, our show was broadcast live when it airs at 7 a.m. Eastern on the Freedom Station. And it was a call-in show. Basically, people would have the telephone number and we'd take calls for the entire hour unless we had a special pre-planned guest who would join us for small blocks at a time. But for the most part, we had people calling in from all over the country, really, because we had a lot of people in the Philadelphia area, but sometimes you'd have a caller who's listening over the internet from Texas or from California or wherever it may be, and have discussions like that. Well, when everybody gets locked down, that all changed very quickly, and we kind of had to change the format of the show. Now, not necessarily the substance and the content as far as the topics like you're talking about, but there were a lot of things that had to change during that period. So, Chris, were you raised in New England?
No, actually, I am originally from born in Alaska.
Wow.
Originally, I grew up back and forth between Alaska and Northern California. And then 2009, 2008, 2009, I got a divorce and I was a Red Sox fan. I grew up hating the Yankees. So I became a Red Sox fan. And in 2009, I was like, you know what? I want to go somewhere and start over. And being a Red Sox fan, I was like, you know what? I'm not the biggest fan of Florida. So I'm moving to Massachusetts.
Wow. So why did you move back and forth from Alaska to Northern California? Was there any reason for that with your family situation or anything?
Parents divorced when I was young. My dad was a military brat during Vietnam, and my grandfather at one point was stationed in Alaska, and he fell in love with it. So when he got out of the Army, he and my mom got out of the Army. In mid-70s, they moved to Alaska, and then once my parents divorced, my mom we moved around a little bit and ultimately ended up settling in the Sacramento area.
So, culturally, big difference between Alaska and Northern California, no?
Huge.
And so you got a taste of a little of each as you were growing up?
Yeah. I always thought it was an interesting perspective, being in a pretty, an urban area like, the Sacramento area and all the pros and cons that come with that. And then going to Alaska, where at that point where I lived in Alaska, Alaska's constantly going through like growing pains just as a state, but it was going through the area where I lived and where I grew up was really going through a kind of an identity crisis and a transformation because people were was right outside of Anchorage, which is the largest city in Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
And where I grew up, a lot of people who started making money and being successful, they moved outside of Anchorage. They moved out to the suburbs.
Mm.
And you had like the first generation of, kids growing up in that area. And, some of the crime, some of the drugs, some of the, people finding alcohol and things like that in this, kind of yuppie area almost, because it was people who had, started making good money, wanted to get out of the city and move out, have a little bit more property, have, stuff like that. And now their kids are getting into high school and things like that. So Alaska is a very interesting place. It is, I don't know anybody who has been there. You either love it or you hate it. And I've loved and hated it over the years. It's an extreme place. I mean, the weather, right now, just earlier today, was telling somebody who is looking to go up there on vacation, I said, bring a sleep mask, because this time of year, the sun doesn't really go down. So you have to be prepared for that when you go up there on, for this, awesome summer vacation, and you're there for a week, and you want to go hike and you want to go camp and you want to go do these things. And then you get up there and you're like, why isn't the sun going down? Why can't I get any sleep? So just, very intense, very, very different place. And then
That's gotta be wild.
And then I moved to Massachusetts.
Liberty wants to know, have you ever encountered grizzlies when you were out there?
Yeah. My dad, growing up, my dad had a boat, nothing huge, but a recreational boat that we used to go out on the weekends. And many times I have been 30 yards, 40 yards offshore, watching grizzly bears eat fish and eat and walk up and down the shoreline, stuff like that, far enough away that we were okay. But yeah, I've seen them.
Wow. And a lot of people carry firearms in Alaska. So
yeah. And funny about that. So I remember the first time I realized that. I was in there's Safeway. We don't have Safeway in New England, but we have
like
Safeway on the
grocery
East
store.
Yeah, on the West Coast. And I saw a guy in in his Carhartts with a huge handle sticking out of his jacket. And it was based on what I remember, it was probably like a 357 or a 44 Magnum. It was a huge gun as a kid. And I remember seeing that. And then, this is me coming from California, where, guns are bad and people who carry guns are bad. And I remember literally being in the line at the grocery store and being like, what the hell is that?
Yeah.
So yeah, Alaska is people, it's still not entirely uncommon to see old trucks that have gun racks in the back of the back window.
Wow. And isn't it interesting how you have these two dramatically different cultures, California and Alaska, similar to, I lived in New York and then go out to Oklahoma. I think the first time I've ever seen anybody open carry was in New Mexico when I was on my way driving out to the Arizona League out there. And I was in a Pep Boys because my car had broken down. And this old man with a cowboy hat walks in. He's got a 1911 out there on his hip. And people can do that out here, huh?
Yeah.
It's interesting. Blows your mind. So what was it like in the Sacramento area? Because you said that in Alaska, in the city, there were crime problems out there.
Yeah. Alaska in many different facets has always dealt with substance abuse problems.
Huh.
Going back to, the Native American population there, the Eskimos, the natives only had, drugs and alcohol introduced to them, I think, like within the last 125 years. So as a culture, biologically, physiologically, their bodies aren't ready for it. So you see there was a lot of, alcoholism, very prevalent. And if you watch any of the shows that are filmed up there, I'm not saying anything disparaging. You could see, you watch Alaska State Troopers or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they will talk about going out to villages that are dry towns and dry villages, where if you bring a handle of Tito's vodka, you could be arrested like you walked in, like you got caught at the airport with a pound of Coke.
Right.
You could get charged with a felony for that, because it's so rampant in that society. But then with Alaska being such an extreme place in the winter, the winter in Alaska, it's not for everybody. And unfortunately, most people who it's not for don't realize that until they are, they're there and they're stuck there. Alaska during the winter has per capita the highest suicide rate in America. And I think it actually might be the world.
Wow.
It's so cold. It's so dark. In a lot of ways, you can be very isolated, even from people just in your own area, because of the cold, the snow, the extreme cold. It can be a real dark place for people. So as long as I can remember, there have always been issues up there with, alcohol, with drugs, with substance abuse. It's always been, very rampant up there. But then one of the things that also makes it interesting, or makes that hard, is that Alaska, it's kind of a very transient place. You have the oil industry, and you have the fishing industry and the travel industry. So you have people constantly rotating in and out of there. So there's some kind of seedy areas and industries in that area that are trying to cater to, the guys who came down from working in Prudhoe Bay and have $25,000 in cash on them, and they want to party.
So it seems that I think the lesson that is to be learned here is that regardless of where you put a city, there's going to be crime, right? Even if it's all the way out in Alaska, you put a city there, there's going to be crime. How is I keep wanting to say Stockton, like the Diaz brothers, even Sacramento, right? Team Alpha Male.
Yep. Yeah.
Sacramento. So how is that? What was the crime in Sacramento?
There was crime. I didn't find it to be, honestly, that extreme, because I was more used to it. Coming from more of a, growing up there, and the fact that when I was growing up, there were probably as many people in the greater Sacramento area as there were in the state of Alaska. So, it's like looking at something from, 100,000 feet as opposed to 10,000 feet. The crime area, dealt with gangs, all of the stuff that we dealt with, and I'm sure you dealt with it, growing up in New York and on the East Coast. The gangs were a little bit different, but, especially in the 90s, in the late 80s, early 90s, street gangs, that whole culture was coming up, everywhere.
Sure.
So we had a lot of that. But I found, I had a few issues growing up when I was younger in Sacramento, but I found that to be a place that, as long as you had a good, head on your shoulders streetwise, it wasn't that bad of a place. Sacramento is, of the major cities in California, you got LA, San Francisco, San Diego, and now I think it's LA, San Francisco, San Diego, and then like Orange County, and then Sacramento, as far as major areas. So I never actually found it to be a dangerous place, a bad place to live. It's definitely not Stockton. I'll
It's
tell you
not
that.
Stockton.
The Diaz brothers, man, those guys, they came up. They came up in what was and still is a pretty rough town.
Really?
Yeah, Stockton is still pretty widely known for having a lot of gang problems, a lot of gang activity, a lot of crime.
Oh, read a couple of good fighters out of that. So you go in 2009, you moved to Boston. 2009 is the year that U.S. Law Shield started. So obviously you're doing something else at that point in time. What was your career looking like at that point when you moved across the country?
I had the brilliant idea of I was in banking, of moving right around the time that the banking crisis happened.
Oh,
And yeah, it was a great time to sell most of my stuff and move across country to where I really didn't know anybody.
wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And so what did you end up doing when you got out here? When you got out to, I say out here to the East Coast comparatively, and you're in the middle of this banking crisis, as you say, and you're looking for a new job. Did you decide to change fields at that point?
At that time, I had fallen back on the fact that I had been a bouncer and I had been a bartender at different stages in my life. So, I had insurance background. So, I started selling some life insurance, and I was, bouncing a few nights a week, bar backing here and there, a bartending gig here and there, just to keep things going. I remember once there was a story in the news. I think it was end of 09, beginning of 2010. There was a strip club down in Providence that was hiring, and they had something like 2,500 people show up. There was a line like wrapped down around the block, and there were people who had, at that point, with the recession and everything that was happening at the time, there were people who had PhDs, who had their MBAs, who were
Wow.
going to, look to go get a bartending job or work the door at, what was it? The Cadillac Lounge, I think it
Uh,
was.
not quite a house of ill repute, but I was trying to think of the radio friendly way to talk about it.
Yeah.
So
It's no Moonlight
those are
Money
hard
Ranch.
times. Those are hard times. You had people lining up for a job, right? That's crazy. I mean,
Yeah, but
do
it
you think
just went to
you might
illustrate
be
that.
looking at something like that around the corner right now? Those kinds of financial hard times, because it seems like it's just a matter of time. No.
In my opinion, yeah, you can. This can only we can only sustain this for so much longer.
Yeah.
Before something has to give.
Yeah.
Something has to give somewhere.
So now when you get into stuff like this and you talk about bad economy and everything, that does seem to have a correlation with crime. And you look at areas with poverty, right? You
Absolutely.
tend to see more crime, and the more people are stricken by poverty, the more crime you're going to see. And the people who have worked hard for the things that they have. And by the way, I didn't interrupt you to say this, but the fact that you had made something of yourself in the banking industry, moved across the country, and then had to figure out a way to continue to work and sustain and working multiple jobs, that says a whole lot about you. Because a lot of people in that situation would, sit in the corner and try to collect a check from the government and say, poor me, poor me. We should be, somebody should be taking care of me because of all this stuff. You see a lot of victim mentality being pushed today. And you didn't do that. You went and you worked multiple jobs, said, I'm going to figure out whatever I got to do and do whatever it takes, just as a side note. But when you have people who have worked hard for what they have, and you see this rise in crime, when you have hard financial times, these people tend to want an option to protect themselves. And people who are not necessarily gun people will become firearms owners, right? And particularly out in places like Massachusetts and Connecticut. I'm not familiar with what that looks like, what being a gun owner looks like. Because in New York, it was just simple growing up. There's no such thing as a law-abiding gun owner. It was you're either a cop and you have a gun, or you're a criminal and you have a gun. I didn't know any regular family people who did. Is it quite that bad in Massachusetts and Connecticut, or is there a culture of people who do own firearms? Is it somewhat attainable out there?
There is a culture in New England for guns. There, Connecticut, there are. Don't quote me on this, but I think there's something like over 250,000 residents that have their license to carry in Connecticut. I don't think it's that high in Massachusetts, but they're, outdoorsmen's clubs, sportsmen's clubs are everywhere. Gun stores, gun ranges are, pretty prevalent around here. People, it's really interesting the way that you pose that, because during COVID, and it wasn't just in this area, but nationally, gun sales went through the roof.
Sure.
And it was, most of the, let's be honest, going into COVID, there were a ton of gun owners. They weren't the ones that were, necessarily out there buying up all these new guns. They were buying up some, and they were buying up a lot of ammo because they were, worried about the writing that was on the wall. But you had all these people who, in February of 2020 were anti-gun, and by April of 2020 we're like, asking, hey, do you know how to get a gun? I need to get a gun. I think I need to get a gun. Like things are getting a little crazy right now. We right now are, and don't quote me on all these details because I am not quite up to speed on all of them, but we just both recently in Connecticut and Massachusetts have had sweeping gun legislation proposed that I've been joking through, some of the classes and some of the meetings that I've had, that Connecticut looked at New Jersey and said, hold our beer. And then Massachusetts looked at Connecticut and New Jersey and said, hold our kombucha. Because it literally, they're both, it appears, I could be wrong, I don't know, it appears that they're trying to formulate the things in a very similar way as your California, Washington, New Jersey gun laws, and they're troubling. They honestly, they are troubling.
Now, hasn't Massachusetts always been pretty difficult as far as firearms ownership and everything? I remember hearing that Aaron Lewis was, I don't know if he supported the NRA or something like that, but finding out essentially that this guy's one of us. He's a pro-gun guy, and then he's from Massachusetts, right? And I remember thinking that was strange. It's like, well, Massachusetts of all places, I'm pretty sure that they've got some stringent gun laws. Hasn't it always been pretty tight out there? Like, it's not like Pennsylvania where you can walk into the courthouse and get a license to carry, right?
So there right now, the process is that you have to sit through a 4 to 6 hour license to carry class, and then you have to apply for a license, and then it falls on your local like your local police chief, or city, or I guess county, depending on where you're at. So Massachusetts is really interesting in the standpoint that you have Boston, and then it starts to thin out as you go west You get out to Natick and Framingham, it's thinning out a little bit. You get out to Worcester, and it starts to thin out. And then once you get past Worcester, it gets real country. And then you get out to Springfield, which is not a great town. It's constantly or consistently voted one of the worst cities in Massachusetts, one of the worst cities in America. Extremely high crime, extremely high crime. And, Aaron Lewis is from, I believe, like 2 towns over from where I live. So my wife and I moved out to Western Massachusetts last year, sold our condo, moved out this way, and it's a lot different out here. It's a lot different, but Aaron Lewis, I don't know how. This goes out on terrestrial radio, right?
It does, yes.
Okay, so I will say this. Aaron Lewis at his concerts generally leads the crowd in
Let's Go Brandon.
Lots of Let's Go Brandon.
Okay.
And let's also we'll spin it a little bit and say lots of Let's Go Dylan Mulvaney.
Oh wow.
So he is Aaron Lewis definitely leans to the right. He is a country boy. He is pro Second Amendment. He's pro guns. An instructor that I work with in the Boston area actually did his licensing and did his instructing classes.
Oh, cool.
He's very much in that same right lane as I think you and I are.
That's interesting. Yeah,
and probably many of your listeners.
So most of the listeners, some people listen just because they can't stand us and love to comment that the show was so terrible that they listened for all 2 or 3 hours. I love those people. Love those people. Keep listening. So it sounds almost like there's a drastic difference between Boston, Springfield, some of these other places, similar to maybe New York City versus upstate New York. Have you ever been to New York and upstate New York?
Very. And then it's, it's a good comparison. I would almost say more though, like Philly and, getting out into, kind of rural Pennsylvania a little bit. You said that, not me. But yeah, you get out here and there's farms, there's farmland. One of the biggest, agriculturally in this area out here, one of the biggest things out here is tobacco. There are tobacco fields and tobacco farms all over out here, and it's a huge industry. So yeah, it's a pretty stark contrast once you get, and again, it's once you get west of Worcester on the Mass Pike, you really start noticing a pretty significant change in, the landscape, but in the mentalities out this way as well.
Now, is Connecticut like that though, or is it mostly?
Connecticut is also very much like that as well.
Oh, really?
I grew up, growing up in Sacramento. Sacramento for me when I was growing up was always a pretty conservative area. You've got your LA and San Francisco that are, where the 70% of the population density of the state of California live, and the state votes as such. But I also lived there and remember when Democratic Governor Gray Davis was impeached and Arnold Schwarzenegger, ran, the Last Action Hero ran as a Republican. And, not only did they throw him out of office, they elected him. Right. So it's very similar to that here, where you've got your Boston area and then, a few spots throughout the state that are extremely blue. And then you've got a lot of red in the state, and very much the same way with Connecticut.
Were you living in California when, yeah, I guess you were, when Schwarzenegger was the governor?
Yep.
What did you think of his leadership as a governor? And I
Uh,
guess it might be difficult not to taint that view with what he's said since then, because some of the things that he's said since then have been totally leftist tyrannical type stuff.
you mean
That
the forget your freedom or
yeah,
whatever it was that he
yes,
said?
exactly.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. It's hard
That
to
one,
kind
that
of
that one just personally, as somebody who grew up watching, Pumping Iron, and
Mhm.
one of the very first movies I think I ever saw in a drive-in theater was The Terminator.
Oh yeah.
I loved him, and again, I think that a lot of people at the time, I don't know, a lot of people at the time really just had no idea what was happening and where the country was going and all of that. I was disappointed in those comments. I thought that they were, incredibly irresponsible as
Mm,
somebody who held as much um, power in his words that he did. I found it to be, really, he alienated a lot of people in that, because he did run as a Republican. Now, I think that if you were to look back on that now, and you were to use a relatively current phrase, I think that people would call him a rhino.
right.
I think
Yeah.
that was pretty evident. As far as his leadership style went, I think that he won because he was the Terminator. He was
Gotcha.
Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he was popular. But once he got into office, he really had absolutely no idea what he was doing. He really didn't. It was pretty evident, because he ran a campaign, and then once the campaign was over, then it was like, okay, now it's time to actually do some stuff. And it was kind of like, there were a lot of excuses, oh, I
Mm,
can't do this because, I don't have the, the
the
I don't
votes
have the
and
support of the legislature, and
right.
this and that. And there were always excuses. And there were a lot of people that were like, dude, we just did that. We did something that was historical for this.
Right. Yeah, so it's anticlimactic.
Very.
Mm,
It
mm.
really was.
If I told you I interacted with him face to face at Gold's Gym Venice 2 weeks ago, what would you say?
I think, to be honest, I think that would be amazing.
Uh,
I
I'll
would.
tell you the story off the air.
You can tell me the story next week.
Yeah. But I always thought it'd be interesting to hear from somebody who's actually over there during that time. You know, there's only so much of a gauge you could have when you're from the outside looking in, and
Hmm.
certainly it's really hard not to taint your opinions of the guy with the stuff that he said. Jeremy Miller says, "I guess that would happen. That's what happens when your father was a Nazi." Might- uh, that might be a problem for some people. So, when we're talking about uh, these gun owners in Connecticut and Massachusetts, do any of them, in your opinion, or from what you've seen, have to sort of be gun owners quietly? Do they have to keep that a secret or anything like that, being out there in fear that they're going to be chastised for some reason just because of the overall politics out there?
There are concerns, and I warn people that they shouldn't, have, um, stickers on their vehicles.
Yeah, and that's
Because
anywhere really. That's anywhere really.
it really is. But when you live in an area where, um, that it's so, hotly contested between, political beliefs, the excuse me, I'm sorry, the uh you still see you still see Hillary for president stickers on Subarus and Harris Biden stickers, and then you see Trump stickers all over.
Oh,
and,
wow.
And the people who don't like Trump, my personal opinion is if you're driving around with a, in any state, honestly, but around here, if you're driving around in a vehicle and you have a Glock, a Sig Sauer, an NRA, or some of the local, political organization stickers in your windows, all you're doing is you're inviting somebody who's having a bad day, who you may cut off in traffic or something like that. You're inviting them to decide that they're going to try to lash out at you.
Well, I had a case once where a guy cuts off my guy on the highway. My guy flashes the lights and honks the horn, perhaps gives him the finger, pulls around and drives away. And as he's driving away, the guy who cut him off notices that he's got an NRA hat in his back window. Well, if you want to get back at a guy who's got an NRA hat in his back window in Pennsylvania, what do? You call the police and you say, well, this green Toyota just pointed a gun at me. Exactly. And so my guy gets to work. He gets out of his car and there's police rolling up, guns drawn, get on the ground. They got an accusation and they patted my guy down. And guess what? He's carrying a firearm, just like most everybody else who's got an NRA hat in their back window.
You got a better than 50-50 shot when you're, 100%.
So now they got an accusation and they've got a firearm. So that was enough for them to move forward. And we were able to resolve the case in his favor, but it was after 2 years. And he lost his health. He got sick, very sick over those 2 years. He spent tens of thousands of dollars, lost his job. It impacted his family tremendously. And, even though we resolved the case in his favor, did that guy win? There are no winners in these cases. So that's a very good point that you raise. I don't think enough people are aware of that because a lot of people take the position, they say, well, why should I have to hide it? Well, maybe you shouldn't have to hide. Maybe you shouldn't have to, but these are the cards that were dealt, right? This is reality. We could bang our head into a brick wall all we want. You know what? You don't have to keep it to yourself. You're right. You don't have to. But if you want to avoid this risk, then here's what you will do. Right.
And I think that's common sense. I'm not going to, well, actually, I probably would. I was going to say I'm not going to Yankee Stadium, all decked out in all, my Red Sox gear and this and that. I mean, I guess I might if it's a, Red Sox Yankees series, but if you're not literally looking to invite a problem, then don't do it. If you know that I just think people should be a little bit smarter than that. And I understand that people want to say it's my constitutional right and I'm going to do this and nobody's going to tell me that I can't have an NRA sticker and nobody's going to. Well, we now have red flag laws that are popping up everywhere and they're becoming an issue where if somebody decides that, people want to say that, they can't be used maliciously, but they can.
Oh, 100%. Get out of here. Come on.
Right. But they can, and they are. And
100%.
It's like, if you're going to invite that trouble, then you better be prepared, for the trouble that you have invited to really, really show its ugly head.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree. It's very, very wise words there. How did you get into firearms?
To be honest, I've always had an appreciation for them, but I got into this, we'll call it this world, because I'm an insurance guy.
Oh.
And when I was originally interviewed for my current position, I was asked 2 questions. You have your insurance license? I said yes. And how do you feel about the Second Amendment? And I was like, great. I'm 100% support it and this and that. And they were like, all right, cool. Well, we think you're hired. We think we're going to go ahead and move forward with you. And I was like, okay. But I'm more of an insurance guy than I am a gun guy. I am 100% pro, but I've never really had a ton of experience with them, and I didn't grow up with them. My dad, both my dad and my stepdad both own guns and this and that, but it was never, I didn't grow up shooting all the time. I grew up shooting a little bit, but not a ton.
Oh, that's interesting. You're always into combat sports too? Is that something that you were into for a long time?
Dude, I still remember to this day, what was it, 1988, when Tyson lost to Buster Douglas. I remember watching
sounds
that.
Right. I would have been one at the time, but
I remember
right.
watching that on HBO with my dad and crying.
Wow.
I cried because I loved Mike Tyson. And even at that age, I remember when he got knocked down and I got upset because I was like, he knocked Douglas down earlier and it was a super slow count. Tyson gets knocked out and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You're out. And I was so upset.
He put his mouthpiece in backwards, right?
He did. I mean, don't get me wrong. Buster Douglas hit him harder than that man had ever been hit. But I've loved combat sports for, boxing. I grew up with boxing. I loved boxing. And then I still remember the first time, the first thing I saw with MMA or with UFC, it used to be, they were tough man competitions, and they were like, a pay-per-view from a bar in like, the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma. And it was like, we got, 20 of the toughest guys around and they're going to fight. And then
Tank Abbott.
Yeah. And then growing up in Sacramento, Ken Shamrock was out of that area. The Lion's Den was there, his training center and all that. And I bumped into Ken a couple of times.
Great dude. Great dude. Pro Second Amendment too.
Yeah. Great dude, but terrifying, especially back in the day when, as I don't know, I don't want to say anything that'll get Ken like looking me up, but there was a point in time where Ken looked like, as Joe Rogan would say, he was on all of the Mexican supplements.
Oh yes.
And I remember bumping into him one day at the post office, and I bumped in. I like literally walked into him, and I realized who it was, and I said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Shamrock." But he couldn't have been nicer. He couldn't have been nicer. So
he was he was on the Alistair Overeem high horse meat diet. That's what he was doing. Eating a lot of horse meat.
Have you seen Alistair lately?
He's real thin, right? He's vegan now. I heard
he's now supposedly a vegan, and yeah, he is. I would say Alistair has probably lost 50 to 60 pounds.
Yeah, no, he's unrecognizable compared to the Uberim days, the pre-USADA.
Yeah.
Where they started getting into tests. So you watched mixed martial arts back when they first started, when the UFCs were first starting, when they had like the competitions with.
Yep.
Oh, wow. And what did you think about it back then? Did you love it instantly?
Yeah, I did. I just thought it was the coolest thing ever because, growing up, similar to you as, that shirt that you've got on, I grew up, when the 80s, man, I was a Hulkamaniac, and I loved that. So for me, I remember the first time I saw anything with UFC, I was like, so it's like boxing and it's like WWF, but it's together. And I was like, hell yeah, I'm in for this.
And no predetermined outcomes like the WWF. So.
Yeah.
And you could tell the difference the first time you watch a real mixed martial arts fight, particularly back in the day when they weren't wearing gloves and stuff, and you see the kinds of blows these guys are taking to the head.
Like that one, there's a famous clip from one of the early ones where two guys go, one guy almost gets the other one in like I don't know, it's like the wishbone or something, where he had his arms,
Yeah,
legs around
Gary Goodrich.
and
Gary Goodrich.
he's just
Yeah.
pounding on his head. That today would not, you can't just do that. But so back then it was, it was crazy. And then to see a guy like, Hoist Gracie, who, the first time anybody saw him, they were like, this guy's going to get absolutely obliterated.
Right.
And then just come in and absolutely, run roughshod across everybody with, Brazilian jiu-jitsu. It was insane.
We had Jeremy Miller, just to interrupt you quickly. I want to continue on with this. Jeremy Miller says, what do you think about Gifford's law using gun laws from the 1860s from states like Alabama to justify laws today to keep guns out of places of worship and lawsuits? I will say that I'm not familiar with the story, but I presume that what you're saying is that there are lawsuits that they're using this to justify them in light of Bruin with the history, text, and tradition, and saying that there were laws back then. I guess number one is going to be, you have to analyze under the Bruin test, what is the relevant time period, right? What is the relevant time period to look at for history, text, and tradition? Interestingly enough, when I was on the case against the city of Harrisburg, at the 11th hour, they tried to bring in this old law from Pennsylvania that was legislated specifically to Harrisburg and basically banned concealed carry in the city of Harrisburg. And they claimed if you can't show that this law has been repealed, then it's still valid law, and therefore your lawsuit means nothing. So I thought it was ridiculous when I looked at this. Surely this can't be true. So I ended up at the Senate library because this law that they presented was not published anywhere in any of the consolidated statutes. So on all of our online resources and everything that we use for legal research, it wasn't there. So I had to go into the Senate library, and this guy took me into this special room. He had a velvet rope thing that he had to pull off, and we had to go up a spiral staircase to these actual books. And I opened up these books. I swear I felt like the pages were going to fall apart. They probably hadn't been opened since the 30s, and dust is coming out. And ultimately, I found legislation that repealed every criminal statute that wasn't in effect at that time in order to create the new crimes code. So that law that they presented was invalid. We were able to prove it, and it meant nothing. Jim Crow era law is what Jeremy Miller's saying. Yeah, I think that what it's going to come down to, and I know nothing about the story. I'd have to look into it. Maybe we'll be able to talk about it more intelligently next week. But I would think my instinct would be that the argument's going to become over when that relevant period is for history, text, and tradition. So we'll talk more about that next week. You got any words on that, Chris Jones?
My big question was that Jeremy Mayhem Miller?
Jeremy Mayhem Miller. This is the Jeremy Miller from Pennsylvania, regular listener to the program. He's actually he's been on the program because after being a longtime listener, he was elected to the local government out there in Columbia County, and stands up for our Second Amendment rights in that capacity.
Nice.
So I guess back to mixed martial arts. So you've seen the way it's developed. You're talking about Gary Goodrich. I believe it's Gary Goodrich with the elbows.
But, I think so, yeah. But Big Daddy Gary Goodrich, yeah.
But then there were like also people who would watch Pride would see knees to the head and kicks to the head and stuff like that you wouldn't see when you're watching the UFC. And it was kind of strange that distinction there that no elbows, but you can knee to the grounded opponent in the head, and you can soccer kick him in the head.
Pride was crazy. That was such a. There were so many amazing fights, and I actually think I think it's really cool now that ESPN owns, or UFC owns, like the Pride library. So if you want to go back and watch some of those old fights over there, you can. And there are some, if nothing else, you just look at the fact that you can absolutely tell that there was no such thing. Nobody had ever even heard of anything like USADA way back.
USADA in the Pride days.
Dude.
No, sir. No, sir. Look at
Vanderlei Silva back
I was
then.
just going to say Vanderlei. You had Crow Cop back then. You had
that's my guy.
Dan Henderson in multiple weight classes, right?
Yeah.
You had Fedor.
And then, I mean, if nothing else, Overeem back then.
Overeem back
then.
Dude,
Overeem, before he got into MMA, Overeem was like 180-pound kickboxer. He was rail thin. He was he looked like he was a basketball player.
Like what he looks like today, or
kinda, yeah. I mean, and then, you don't believe in science, like, dude, Alistair Overeem is living proof that science works.
He had Paulo Costa's secret juice, right?
Yeah.
There were some great fighters. Don Fry, right?
Oh, dude, Don Fry is still amazing. If you look him up, there's videos of him anywhere. Like, you should get Don. Although I don't know if how long or how much of a delay you have, but you should get Don Fry on your show.
That's actually a good idea. I had him, a friend of mine from law school. His favorite fighter of all time is Don Fry. And two interesting facts, I guess. One interesting fact is that my father worked on a movie set with Don Fry for 2 weeks, a movie called 13. I don't know if you've ever seen it because it wasn't released in theaters in the United States for a whole number of reasons. You know, it's a great film. Forrest Griffin has a small part in the movie. Mickey Rourke, Michael Shannon, Jason Statham. Really good movie.
No, but I may have to look it up.
You should check it out. It's called 13. Really interesting story. Hard movie to watch because it's a heavy story. But my dad's on the set with Don Fry for 2 weeks, and doesn't say anything about him. My dad's not into mixed martial arts the way I am or anything like that. So watching the movie when it comes out, because when he was telling me what the movie was about, I couldn't wait to see it. So I'm sitting there watching the movie, and I see my dad, and he's next to Don Fry. I was like, "Is that Don Fry?" I call him up. I was like, "Dad, you were in the movie with Don Fry?" He was like, "What do you mean?" I was like, 13. The guy's standing next to you, Don Fry. He was like, "Oh, Don? Yeah. Why? What? You know him?" I was like, "Do I know him?"
Yeah.
He's one of the best fighters to ever live. What are you talking about?
And that guy's still a character.
He's like, "Oh, nice guy." I didn't know he was a fighter. I thought he owned a diner or something like that. But the second part of the story is my buddy from law school, his favorite fighter is Don Fry. And my buddy gets this new, really amazing job. And I had that app called Cameo where you can get different celebrities to make a video for you. And I looked on fighters. Don Fry had never been on there, but I looked in fighters and I'm like, new to the app, Don Fry. I was like, this is perfect. So I told Don Fry you could make a video for them to tell them what's going on. I said, "Hey, Mike G from Mike G in the Morning, Second Amendment attorney out here in Philadelphia. My buddy is out in Texas. He just got this new gig. Wish him congratulations." So Don, because he's classic, makes the video for my buddy. He's got his desk filled with guns all over the place, all over his desk, and he's cleaning one of his guns with his dog standing on the desk as he's giving the message for my buddy for his Cameo video. All just because I told him I'm a Second Amendment attorney. He puts all that in there.
That's
great.
Awesome.
He's a true character, that guy. But it would be fun to get him on the show. That era of guys, those are the kinds of guys that you were into. You still follow it today at all?
Yeah. Yeah, I followed it. You know, I mean, I feel like they're more, you know, I think all sports, you have the different eras. You know, I think it's unfair it's easy to be like, who's the greatest of all time and this and that. Who, coincidentally enough, in my opinion, pound for pound is John Jones.
That's fair. That's fair.
I think that it's been really interesting to see the evolution of it and the evolution of the fighters. Guys like Don Fry, some of the, we were talking about it briefly last night. Tito, guys who were great in their eras and in their time, but to see how mixed martial arts and the how the technicians of their martial arts have evolved and how the fight game has evolved way more into, the science of things now. I think that it's been really cool to watch something like that evolve. I wasn't around when, the NBA or boxing started or the NFL, but to watch a sport from its infancy to now being one of the biggest sports on the planet, in the UFC being one of the biggest sports organizations on the planet, I think it's been really amazing to watch.
That's true. It's a different sport essentially than it was back then. Because when you think about, when I was coming up, 2005, 2006, 2007, you had guys, okay, we were Muay Thai guys, right? And okay, now I've got to learn a little bit of grappling for this kind of a thing. And you had guys before my class of guys who they would just have their soul discipline and go in there against another guy who just had their soul discipline. It wasn't really till, that time that people started to develop those other areas. And now you've got guys who from day one, when they started training, they were training for mixed martial arts.
Yeah.
And they've been,
like for example,
brought up like that.
For example, a guy that I used to love watching him fight, but I don't think that I don't think in today's, era, because, if you were to just pluck him from his prime and put him in today's UFC, Matt Hughes. I think that, phenomenal wrestler, okay on his feet. I don't really recall Matt Hughes having any jiu-jitsu. He was a wrestler. He was a ground and pound guy. And while wrestling is as important to a well-rounded MMA fighter as any, of the other disciplines, because you can go so many different ways with it. If you're a good wrestler, then, chances are you're probably going to be able to pick up jiu-jitsu and Brazilian jiu-jitsu and the grappling of Brazilian jiu-jitsu faster than if you were, an Alistair Overeem who was a kickboxer, or a Chuck Liddell who had a Kempo karate background. Right. So I just think Bo Nickel is a great example right now of a guy who is, literally one of the greatest wrestlers ever.
Pennsylvania's finest.
Yeah. But he has, he proved last weekend. I mean, dude, I didn't see Bo Nickel having hands heavy like that.
If you sneezed during that fight, you missed it.
Yeah. Yeah. But I really didn't think that he had that kind of stand up and
But think about how many guys had a wrestling background and then developed hands and were able to fight like that. Daniel Cormier, right? I mean, knocked out Stipe Miocic. Johnny Hendricks sticks out in my mind. That guy was in Oklahoma, a wrestler out in Oklahoma in college. Well, I guess DC was too, right? They're both Oklahoma State University.
Yeah.
But Johnny Hendricks was straight wrestler. That dude threw hands like no other. Like you saw George St. Pierre's face when they were done fighting. I still have a hard time believing GSP won that fight. But there are plenty of guys like that who had a wrestling background. Dan Henderson, right?
Dan Henderson with one of the greatest punches of all time.
Yeah, right. So there were a lot of guys like that who had the wrestling background, and then translates. Now today we are seeing, like Adesanya is a good example of somebody who's got a primarily a striking background. They come on over. Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva is just different level. I don't know that you can make like a Mount Rushmore of all-time mixed martial artists and not include Anderson Silva. It just how dominant he was and how head and shoulders. I remember him going up to 205 to fight Forrest Griffin, who was a world champion at 205, and
Yeah.
making him look like he had no business being in an octagon with him. Like these
There are
guys are
some people
totally
that
different
just,
levels.
yeah, some people just, Silva always looked like to me that like he was just on another level. Like he was
Yeah,
moving at a different speed,
yeah.
like everybody else was moving slower than him.
That's a great way to put it. It's a great way to put it. You say Jones number one. Do you really believe that he beat Dominic Reyes? And now Reyes a tough go of it since then, but I cannot watch that fight and say that John Jones beat Dominic Reyes.
Here's why I'll say yes. Because in the fight game, it is not you have to beat the champion.
Fair enough.
And at the same time, as we have learned, the fight game, I don't care how biased the judges are supposed to be, or how unbiased, excuse me, Freudian slip there, but they're going to be biased. And, I think that there is still a little bit of that mentality of like, did John Jones do enough to eke that out? Yeah. Did Dominic Reyes do enough to take the belt from him? No, he didn't.
Fair enough. If you look at, I guess that if you're going by that standard, you're correct. I just think if you look at it by who won 3 rounds of that fight, it was Dominic Reyes, objectively, but perhaps that's not enough in that context. I guess certainly when you got a guy who's been on a run where he's held the belt, or at least has not lost as the champion for how many years. I don't want to say he's held the belt for that many years because there were certainly breaks in between when you had to have interims and
he had a few.
He's had his own issues.
Yeah, he had a few little breaks.
Yeah. Chael Sonnen, entertaining fighter.
Chael was a fun fighter. And what I loved Chael was, one of the first to adopt the Monday Night Raw persona and
Sure.
to come in there and, start talking. I mean, I remember, and even pulling back the, breaking the fourth wall kind of, that saying when he fought Anderson Silva and, he's up there going, this guy lives in LA, right? Like,
Hey, listen.
or no, he lives in Las Vegas. Like, you guys are talking about this being Brazilian.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Chael was a lot of fun to watch. And again, had Chael not run into, John Jones, Chael would have been probably a champion. I personally, it's weird, man, because I actually think that Daniel Cormier, one, I love how they have adapted now and they have a mutual respect for each other. Mm-hmm. But I legitimately think that had Daniel Cormier not lost to John Jones all of those fights, Daniel Cormier would arguably be one of the greatest MMA fighters of all time. I think he already is.
But I agree with you. I honestly, if he doesn't lose that second Stipe fight, which in turn led to the third loss, that I don't think he belonged in there. I think that he was probably in really bad shape by that third fight, and he was dealing with back problems and wasn't really able to train. But if he had won that second fight against Stipe, I think he's still in that conversation, because if you've been able to hold the title at light heavyweight the way he did, and at heavyweight against Stipe, who is regarded as many as the greatest heavyweight of all time, you're able to beat him twice. I think you're still in that conversation. But you're 100% correct.
I agree. And not to take anything away from DC, but I don't know. I won't say that it was lucky, because he had a game plan and he knew Stipe was, opening himself up to that shot that ultimately dropped Stipe. But, there was one punch there. Like one punch did that.
That's true, but he was working him the second fight, and then he got caught. So
yeah,
it could have. I guess that's true that it was one punch that got him there the first time. I don't know that it would have been any different had the fight gone on. So DC is just. I'm probably biased when I talk about DC because number one, he went to school in Oklahoma like I did, and number two, he's just so hard not to like. He's just such a great guy,
He is, and that's where I was going with that because he, honestly, I could watch a 30 for 30 or something on, John Jones and Daniel Cormier, and like that building up to that first fight, the ESPN where they were doing the interviews and they're in each, they're on other sides of the room and they're talking crap to each other. And it's so hard not to just like fall in love with Daniel Cormier because he's a great guy. He really is. And then you put in his, his fighting resume, all of that. If it wasn't for John Jones, he would arguably be considered one of the, at least, and he still is, but he'd be in like the top 3 as opposed to the top 5.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree with that. I agree. So who do you think are the top 3? You mentioned John Jones. You think Anderson's up there?
I think we're talking, you can't,
it's hard, right?
You can't have one without, Hoist. You can't. He literally, he started it. He started it all. And without what he did, there's no telling that, there's nothing to say that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu would have come to the forefront and have the prominence that it's had since he and his family, but I mean, his family, it's been around for generations, but he took it to the mainstream and made it a, I live in small Western Mass. There's a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gym in my home, in the town that I live in. Like it's everywhere now. So I think you can't say, you can't go without John Jones. You can't go without Hoist Gracie. You can't go without I would have to say, if we're just going on strictly like fighting, then yeah, Anderson's definitely there.
And then throw you a curveball. What about how do you take Fedor into account? He never got to fight in the UFC, but how dominant was that guy when he was in his prime? Was that not a scary man when he
what was terrifying about him was how terrifying he wasn't. I mean, he looked like he looked like he worked for UPS.
Right.
He looked,
I guess unassuming, but when you look at his eyes, though,
he looked like Kevin James, from King of Queens. Like he looked like he just stepped off of a UPS truck, took off his clothes, and then came out there and did it. The only thing that I've ever thought about with Fedor was the level of competition there for him. And that's always, and I mean, I know that that's always been the argument.
Right.
I would say Fedor is in the top 10. I think, you're looking at, so what did I say? John Jones, Hoist Gracie, Anderson Silva. You have to look at, somebody like George St. Pierre.
Right.
You also have to look back, though, at guys like Don Fry, Mark Coleman, some of these, some of those guys from that era. You have to make an argument, maybe but then I think you start getting into, are you looking at their influence on the sport, or
Right.
them
Yeah,
actually
I
being
see. I think we were talking just straight skill, just
straight
ability.
skill? I would have to say Jones, Gracie, Silva,
GSP.
GSP, and then
A lot of people mention Khabib nowadays in that conversation, but I just don't think the longevity and the strength of schedule was there, frankly. Because if you look at like Jose Aldo and the records of the guys that he fought, I know it's different weight classes, but
yeah,
you know the guys that he fought and their records versus the records of the guys that Khabib fought, it's just
yeah. But then you also you can't sleep on, or you can't forget guys like Mighty Mouse, dude.
yeah,
Demetrius Johnson is one of the nastiest fighters to ever put on a pair of gloves.
yeah.
So
I'm biased against. I don't know what it was, but I couldn't get into the 125s when he was on top of his reign, and he was totally dominant. By all statistical measures, he's perhaps the greatest fighter to ever do it. Uh, but I don't know what it was. But when Cejudo took him out, and I mean, I can watch Figueiredo Moreno go 10 times. You could run that fight back once every 3 months. I'll buy it every single time. But I
yeah,
had a hard time bringing myself to pay for Mighty Mouse fights. I always did because my friends haven't staged an intervention yet and they're not really good friends. But there was just something that was really tough about getting into that 125 while he was around. I don't know.
yeah.
Maybe there just wasn't a chance for us to get familiar with other personalities because he got there early and then just stayed on top for so long. It almost became predictable. Maybe that was it.
Yeah.
Like a Mayweather sort of thing, right?
Well, I think that I actually think a Mayweather is a good comparison. I think right now, and I don't know that I believe that she is fully retired, but I think Amanda Nunez kind of found herself in that same boat of I've beaten everybody.
Right.
And when you just start throwing, to use the term, tomato cans at her, and she just keeps beating them, then it's just like, why am I watching this? Like,
Right. Yeah.
why? Like, it's not fun anymore. I mean, Amanda Nunez, like, let's be honest, she peaked at that with that, shot against Cyborg.
Right.
Like, that
Yeah.
was one of the greatest knockouts of all time. And that solidified her as probably the greatest female fighter of all time.
And she came back and took Juliana out after losing the title to her.
Yeah.
So, yeah. There's a lot to talk about in terms of mixed martial arts.
Absolutely.
There's Nogueira's one that I guess we don't talk about too much. He's another great Nogueira.
Then you also can get into looking at, I mean, like guys like Overeem.
Mm-hmm.
Overeem was I think he held every major title except for like UFC.
Mm-hmm.
He was a, multiple time like Grand Prix champion going through Pride. He was a world champion at like 18 years old in kickboxing. And again, it goes back to there's different eras, and there's, as the sport has evolved, Johnny Unitas, amazing quarterback, couldn't even make the worst team in football today.
It's interesting when you think about that. You go back and you look at baseball, because when it comes to high levels of competition, that's what I'm most familiar with. But you look at guys from the old days, they didn't throw that hard, and not that throwing hard is everything. You got location, you got off speed pitches, you know, things of that nature. But a lot of these guys wouldn't get a look today.
Oh, absolutely.
Who were considered greats that we all know their names and everything like that. It's just the athletics in general has changed a whole lot. The way we treat our bodies, the way people train, and the way you understand mechanics,
Dude, I mean, you look at, how did the difference between how, I don't know, Babe Ruth treated his body and Barry Bonds treated his body.
Sure.
Like, Babe Ruth was smoking cigars and drinking bourbon and, chasing women, around trains and then going out and hitting 2 home runs. And, Barry had the clear.
Yeah. I find that whole stuff fascinating. All the Balco stuff and everything like that.
That was a wild time to be a sports fan, and especially
in Northern California. Were you living in Northern California?
Being in Northern California, and everything that kind of happened with McGuire, happened with Bonds and Sosa, and how that all came out. Because I'll be honest, I'm of the belief that I don't personally care. I legitimately
if everybody did it, or not everybody, but
everybody back then.
There were so many that it's pretty difficult to decipher who was and who wasn't, and it was for better or for worse part of the game at the time, and just let it run.
There was a very famous guy who played for the Orioles back in the 90s who I think like one season hit like 3 home runs, and then the next season he came back looking like junior Mr. Olympia and hit almost 50 home runs. And that's just living proof right there. Like it was
Brady Anderson.
I didn't say his name. You did, just in case.
Okay. All right.
But yeah, that guy.
No, you meant Greg Brady.
Yeah,
guy from the television show.
80 Branderson.
Yeah, it was definitely a different time. I know that when I was playing in college, there were a lot of guys from Northern California. When they would go home, they'd all train with Victor Conti. This is post Balco, though. He had like this whole new company.
Yeah.
It was totally legit.
Yeah.
He was on the straight and narrow by that point. Well, everything is above board, I'm sure.
I bet.
Yeah. Good deal. Well, it's been a whole lot of fun talking with you. Before we get this wrapped up, any questions from our listeners? We talked about a whole lot, from Alaska to guns in the Northeast to mixed martial arts and boxing. I'm having a lot of fun talking.
I do, and we never even we didn't even get into like pro wrestling and your shirt or any of that. Like,
oh yeah,
I mean,
New World Order. I get quite a few comments on this when I wear it out.
I could go for hours on pro wrestling, and especially that era of it. Again, I could watch. That's actually what I think has been really cool about what the WWE started doing with like A&E and some of the documentaries that they've had that have come out on just breaking down Undertaker, Stone Cold, but the ones about the NWO and the Monday Night Wars and all of that. It was, dude, that was an amazing time to be a wrestling fan.
What do you think? What was the secret sauce of that time? Because WCW,
Hogan,
it was always
turning heel.
Hogan in and of itself.
I think it was Hogan turning heel.
But don't you think that the outsiders, when they came in, they were kind of on to something, and it was the perfect storm?
I think that they were, but I think had the original plan was that Sting was going to be the third member of the outsiders and was going to be the new, the main, guy in that stable. And I think that would have done something. But dude, you are talking about a generation, almost 2 generations of people that it was, the red and the yellow, the say your prayers, eat your vitamins,
right?
Hulkamaniacs. And when he dropped Macho Man, and when it was, I still remember what is it, Tony Schiavone being like, he's the third member, and just being like what just happened? Like, no, this is, you know.
Did you ever notice? I noticed this the other day because it was just the anniversary, like last week, I'm pretty sure. The Bash at the Beach. And I watched the clip and I noticed that while he's on his way down the ramp, and for everybody who's listening and might not be familiar, in the 90s, Hulk Hogan had been with the WWF for years and years and years as the ultimate good guy. I mean, there's lunch boxes and everything with his face on it. He was the man, but known as being a good guy, good role model, say your prayers, eat your vitamins, like you said. And then he makes the switch over to WCW, which was owned by Ted Turner, and Ted Turner's trying to compete with WWF. There were these two wrestlers who had recently come over from the WWF, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. They both had different names over in WWF. They used their real names in WCW. For a minute, well, I don't know how many people believed it for how long, but they made it seem like they were still with the WWF, but they're coming over to the WCW to invade them. And they were there to take over. Meanwhile, they were really employed by the WCW. So part of the story. And they said,
because, you know, wrestling's not real.
Right. Yeah, of course. And so they set up this match where they had this third man, this third member of the Outsiders who was going to join them. And it was this mystery partner. And originally, as Chris said, it was going to be this guy Sting. And Hogan at the last minute decided that he wanted to be that third man. The problem was they were bad guys. So he was going to be coming out as a bad guy joining the bad guy team. And so my point was, when you watch the video back and Hogan's walking down the aisle, everybody thinks that he's there to help out the good guys in that match. He's coming down in his red and yellow and everything. One of the announcers, I'm not sure who it was, says, "But who is he here to help?" And
I think it was Bobby Heenan.
If you were watching it at the time, you would have been like, "Wait, what do you mean? Who is he here to help? Of course he's here to help the good guys, right? Why would he even think that?" He kind of gave it away by saying that.
And I think that they've even actually commented on that over the years to say that was kind of a, like, you know, that was one of those things that, like, behind the scenes, they were like slapping him, being like, "Shut up! Don't say that.
What's wrong with you?
We're trying to sell this."
Yeah.
I do remember that. That is right, and I think it was Bobby Heenan who was like, "Who's he here to help?"
It's like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, what do you mean? You know, of course, it's, you know, the Hulkster and it's Macho Man.
He just gave it away. But so he drops the leg on the good guys and he joins the New World, says, "This is new. You can consider us the New World Order of Wrestling, brother." And that's what started it all. And they started coming out with these black and white kinds of things. And they were the bad guys, but they were cool. Everybody loved them. Everybody started liking the bad guys. What was it about that? It was, you know, because you would expect him turning heel, people would be extra angry at him for doing it. And at the time, that's kind of the way the crowd reacted, right? They started throwing things into the ring and everything. People were upset.
I think what resonated so much with people on that back then was that they cut the theatrics of wrestling. You know, they weren't, you know, it wasn't the, you know, I mean, they used to have, you know, guys like, you know, Brutus the Barber Beefcake and you know, there were all these theatrics to it. And then it was just these guys coming out with by their real names. And they were, you know, basically saying, "Hey, this is a joke." You know, all of a sudden, you know, it wasn't the, you know, Coco Beware coming out anymore with a parrot. It was some guys coming out to just beat you up. And, you know,
it's like regular tough guys.
Yeah.
Like
and
regular
just be
guys
real
who hang out
honest
motorcycle
about
club or something, you know?
Yeah. And be honest and say, like, you know, this stuff's, you know, these guys are jokes and this and that. And I think that there was a reality to it, and a, you know, and also you have to keep in mind too that, you know, like at that time, you know, I still remember that, you know, stuff was starting to come out, you know, about, you know, like, in WWE, the Montreal screw job and this and that. So people, it was almost like they were no longer trying to hide that wrestling was, kind of predetermined. They were almost kind of, embracing it and embellishing it and talking about it. And there was a part of that of like, hey, eating your vitamins and saying your prayers, doesn't always work. Sometimes sometimes just because you did the right thing doesn't mean you're going to be rewarded for it. And I think there were a lot of people that, in the mid to late 90s that were real, fed up with, being kind of disenfranchised with like, oh, even the Hulkster wasn't real. Even the Hulkster was pissed off and kind of hated his boss. And, and then they built off of that whole, kind of hated his boss thing and was angry with the system with, Stone Cold Steve Austin and the whole, back
Vince
and forth
McMahon.
with him and Vince McMahon and, against the, railing against the system.
Yeah. It's an interesting time. I think there's a lot of life lessons to be learned from professional wrestling. I think that there's, first of all, anybody who watches most of this political media and doesn't realize that it's nothing but professional wrestling, I've got some news for you.
Yeah. I mean, it was very.
Don't take these people too seriously because it's nothing but professional wrestling.
I mean, dude, there was a McMahon in the White House,
right?
Linda McMahon was
part of the cabinet, right?
Part of Trump's cabinet. So yeah, I mean, I think that and I hate the irony of what I'm about to say is that we started off talking about my podcast and talking about how it always divulged into COVID talk, but I really do think that if we've learned anything over the last, I won't just say the last like 4 years, I would say probably the last like 7 years, going back to 16 and that election, is that, it's predetermined. There's a lot going on behind the scenes that we think is real. And we think that, if the good guy just comes out and tells us the truth and says, what we want to hear, then they're going to win. And that's Hulk Hogan's not coming down to save the Ultimate Warrior. And, that's not real. Money talks. And there's a lot more money at play and a lot of the things that we think are a lot of the things that we a few years ago would call you a conspiracy theorist for talking about have really come to be proven to be factual,
confirmed,
than not. And it really does just kind of go to show like it really is kind of crazy, the fact that we're not the ones calling the shots like we think we are. Our vote, doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's the lobbyists. It's the people who are putting the money behind those votes and things like that. And that's disheartening, but it is unfortunately a reality.
I want to close out with a famous sentiment from Uncle Chael P. Sonnen. He once said that he's considered writing a book about this, and you can learn anything you need to know about the government through professional wrestling, because for years and years, you had these governmental entities and the state athletic commissions who would insist upon sanctioning professional wrestlers. So they had governed it as if it were a real sport, and people had to get licensed, and they would have to issue these licenses to the promoters and to the wrestlers so they could walk down the ramp and hit each other over the head with the steel chair as if it were a true competitive contest. So for the government believing that wrestling was real for all that time.
Yeah.
That's all you need to know about the inefficiencies of government. Well, Chris, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I hope we could have you back on the program sometime again, and appreciate you taking the time.
Mike, anytime, man. It's a pleasure. Honestly, I can't speak highly enough about you and about what you do, for us at U.S. Law Shield and just in general, for society with, being as passionate as you are about the Second Amendment and standing up for people's rights. So no, anytime you want me, you need somebody to come on and talk, I'm here.
I appreciate it, brother. Thanks for tuning in. That's all we've got for the time today. I screwed that up. They'll cut that. They'll edit that. That's all time we got for today. Stick around for We the People, the Constitution Matters. Pastor David Whitney, Professor Philadelphia. I'll be joining as your legal analyst. We miss you, Ellie. Daddy loves you.